So the situation of Hamas is one in which I think now, after 3 wars, it cannot continue this same kind of performance. Because the Israelis made it clear in this war that if this happens again, they'll destroy 50,000 houses, not 16,000, 50,000. And they'll kill 20,000 people, not 2,000. And the Israelis will do it and the world won't particularly care. That's very obvious, it's very clear. Most of the world was essentially letting Israel go about what it was doing. So there is no deterrence to the military ability of Israel to destroy Gaza and do huge damage to its people and its infrastructure. So I think Hamas is it's like Hezbollah. They're calculating, they're strategic, they think clearly about the reality, they know what they want to do, they have great technical capabilities, but they have to calculate the political cost and the consequences. And they are in the process of doing that, I'm sure, right now. So that's Hamas. At the level of the Palestinians, the split between Fatah and Hamas and the other smaller groups is one of the great catastrophes of Palestinian politics. And it has given the Israelis an excuse to refuse to negotiate seriously. But it's just an excuse, because when they had a unity government 6-7 years ago, the Israelis still didn't negotiate seriously. So the question of unity or no unity may not be so important for the negotiations, but the unity of the Palestinians under the PLO and with the unified government and the Palestinian Authority, that unity is critical to take the next step, which is to mobilize support for the Palestinian cause in a political battle with Israel around the region and around the world. And the first step has to be 2 elements, which is to really make the unity government work, the reconciliation government work, and let that government run Gaza and revive the economy and bring in aid and let things slowly get back to normal. And the second thing is simultaneously to rebuild the institutions of the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO is the only national institution that represents all Palestinians. And until there is a unified national position among all Palestinians, and you harness the power of the political support of Palestinians everywhere, including in camps here and in Jordan and middle-class Palestinians in London and Australia and Egypt and everywhere, until you harness that power and channel it into a unified diplomatic position, the Palestinians will always be vulnerable, will not be taken seriously in negotiations, and will continue to suffer the same fate that they're suffering now. In Israel, the third level, Israel is within the right. It's an ideological battle within extremist right-wing religious nationalists and political nationalists. It's very troubling. There's nothing that we can do about it right now. There's many different reasons for it. And the only antidote to that is to push a political program that can harness Arab, Islamic, and international support that would force the Israeli people to go back to a centrist kind of government to achieve the kind of peace that they say they want. They want recognition, they want to live in peace, they want to be recognized as a state in the region, and that's the only thing that will help Israel move away from the drift to the right and go back into the center. So Israel is pretty much a lost cause for the Palestinians. The dissent that's evident in the political system is very small scale and episodic. It sometimes talks about social justice, it sometimes talks about political negotiation with the Palestinians, it talks about small issues, but nowhere is the right-wing dominant ideology challenged in a serious way. The fourth level is the Arab world. And I'm sorry, the last thing about Israel is that it's not only a rightist ideology and a super-nationalist ideology with the colonial element of the settlements, it's also heavily militaristic. The slogans we heard coming out of Israel during the last war was racist, they were racist, and they were militaristic. And they're not just talking about Israel has a right to exist, they were talking about we have to kill these Palestinians, kill the Arabs, teach them a lesson they'll never forget. So the right-wing militaristic majority in Israel is what's frightening. And it's equally frightening because it permeates young people. This is not just a question of, immigrants from Russia. That was the case 30, 40 years ago, that were very right-wing. This is now the youth in Israel are adopting this ideology. The fourth level is the Arab world. The Arab world is in great chaos and split deeply along two lines. Ideologically, some people talk of Sunni-Shia split, which is certainly an issue, but I would call it more an ideological split among a pro-Iranian Hezbollah, Hamas kind of revolutionary or resistance front, whatever you want to call it, and the pro-Saudi conservative American-aligned kind of approach. That's one split that's very strong within the Arab world, but the more important split, in my view, is the split among governments and people. And this is becoming very clear. And what we saw in the last war was that many of the Arab governments were clearly supporting Israel, quietly but clearly supporting Israel and wanting it to beat up Hamas. And this is a new development. In the past, there was hints of this, that people were happy to see Hamas get beat up. But then the same thing in Lebanon, when there was wars, Arab governments were happy to see Hezbollah get beaten up. But in the end, Hezbollah and Hamas didn't get defeated. They held their ground and they forced Israel to a ceasefire. But the anti-Muslim brother, anti-Hamas sentiment among Arab governments is very strong, and the sentiments among people in the Arab world are not as deeply felt as that. So there's a clear split between people and leaderships in many Arab countries, and this is a continuation of the uprisings that we saw starting in December 2010. So the Arab world is completely fragmented, at war with itself, in no condition to do anything collectively. So it's not going to be an important arena for dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict right now. The fifth level is the Middle East. And in the Middle East, when you calculate Iran and Turkey into the Arab world and Israel, again, you have a very ideologically polarized situation with a significant shift taking place that sees two important things happening. One is that you're seeing regional players play a bigger role across the region as some of the superpowers play a more limited role. So the superpowers are not leaving the region, the Russians and the Americans, but they're playing more limited roles in certain areas. And the gap is being filled by people like Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, even to a small extent, people like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, and like supporting Egypt and doing attacking Libya. These countries are all playing bigger roles. So regional players are starting to play a much bigger role, and there's regional ideological confrontations that are now a new level of tension and stress across the region. And we see it in Iraq and Syria, we see it here in Palestine, Somalia, and Yemen, Libya. You see it virtually everywhere where there's some tension in society. The second important thing that's happening regionally is that the Gulf countries are starting to act like real countries. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. And what I mean by that is they're sending money and guns, their own troops, around the region, fighting, which is unprecedented, the troops. So the Saudis send troops into Bahrain, they send ammunition and support to the rebels in Syria and other places. They support Egypt in a big way, and Qatar and the UAE both were involved militarily in This is unprecedented, to have Gulf countries using their militaries directly in other Arab countries. They always used to do it indirectly, support somebody, give somebody money, give somebody arms. But now the Gulf countries are openly participating in armed conflicts around the region, and we may see more of it now in the battle against the ISIS in Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. Air Force was directly involved, or some other Arab air forces were directly involved, or some of the special troops or something like that. So the Middle East, again, is in a very different situation with non-Arab powers playing a bigger role. And finally, at the world level, the sixth level, there's a massive lack of interest in either the justice or the resolution of the Palestine issue. And this is, as a Palestinian, I'm very sad to see this, but I think it's a political reality that the world is willing to put up with occasional wars in Gaza and Israel because it doesn't particularly affect anything else. It doesn't particularly create a strategic threat to anybody. And therefore, the world is not very concerned. And when the killing gets to such a high level, you get a little bit of pressure on the UN, but in the end, it's up to the local parties to make a ceasefire. And in the United States, the situation is particularly depressing, where you have the Congress voting, the Senate voting 100 to nothing in the middle of the battle to support Israel completely. So the picture at the Middle East level and the world level is not very encouraging for the Palestinians. So what, in that context, what should happen next from an Arab view, from a Palestinian view? I would say that the absolute top priority is to reconstitute a unified Palestinian political leadership with a clear political position that is representative of majority sentiment among all Palestinians. And that doesn't mean Abu Mazen and his friends or a few people in Hamas leadership in Qatar. It means a widely defined Palestinian consensus among Palestinian people and institutions all over the region in the way that used to happen before, when Palestinians used to meet at the Central Council of the PLO or the National Council, and to have a unified position. And there's two documents that can be built on. One is the 2006 prisoners document, or the reconciliation plan between Fatah and Hamas, which was accepted by Fatah and Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front, and others, which is still an operative document that the major Fatah and Hamas, two major parties, agree on. And the second one is the 2002 Arab Peace Plan, which is still on the table, has never been refuted, has repeatedly been reaffirmed in the Arab League, and it's still a document that I believe should be picked up and used more dynamically to engage Israel and the world in a serious peace negotiation. The second thing that needs to be done, I think, is to build on the successes that Hamas achieved. So I said Hamas is in a difficult situation with some military successes, political a boost for its political support, but huge human and economic and social and environmental problems that are going to be catastrophic to the people in Gaza if they're not resolved. The only way to move, I think, or the best way to move, is to build on those political successes that it did achieve, which are very real. The sentiment supporting what Hamas did was very real in Palestine and other Arab countries at the level of ordinary people, not of governments. But that political sense of self-confidence and achievement needs to be factored into a program that combines the military dimensions of what Hamas has achieved. In other words, a certain deterrence capability that it has achieved. And this is not to be minimized, but the Israelis having to run into bomb shelters every other day is not a big threat. Very few Israelis, 3 civilians I think were killed. But psychologically, it's a huge qualitative move forward from previous days. And when Ben Gurion Airport, half of its flights were canceled for 24 hours, that scares the daylights out of the Israelis. And this is one of the few strategic changes that have happened in the region in recent years, and when you combine it with Hezbollah's capabilities in rocketry and armaments, etc., this starts to make the Israelis at least think twice about starting another war. Now, they still have overwhelming military power, and they can destroy all of Lebanon and all of Palestine, and they wouldn't hesitate to do it if they felt that they were threatened. But they would think twice about doing it, because not only would they suffer military damage if you had a situation where Hezbollah and Hamas were together fighting Israel, but it would create a huge existential crisis for Israel, where many Israelis would say, I don't want to live in this kind of state, I'm going to go back to Poland or Russia or New York, wherever they came from. And the Israelis can't afford to do that. So how do you build on that power or that asset that has been achieved on the military side? It's by agreeing on a program that combines military deterrence and resistance with dynamic political and diplomatic action. And this is something that can only be done by a unified Palestinian national government. The third thing that I think is important to do is to harness the tremendous support for the Palestinian issue that exists in the Arab world and all over the world. If you saw the demonstrations all over the world, there were hundreds of thousands of people in some places in the Arab world. Except the Arab world. Yeah, but sentiment in the Arab world, well, there's a different reason for that. Because the Arabs don't demonstrate for anything anymore. The Arab citizen has been completely squashed. The Arab citizen either emigrates or just stays home watching TV, or goes and joins one of the Islamist militant movements. There is no, after the Arab uprisings and the disappointments that people have, there is no Arab street anymore. So, for the moment, but public sentiment in the Arab world supporting the Palestine cause is huge, which we know from repeated surveys. Every year, there's surveys done by the Arab Center in Doha, by Shibli Telhami at University of Maryland, by Gallup. Every survey that's done shows huge support for the Palestine cause. It's emotional support. It doesn't translate into action because the Arab citizen doesn't have the ability to translate sentiment into action, because we live in mostly non-democratic societies. But how do you harness that massive popular support? And the governments around the world, you saw in Latin America,